just prior to Expo, your appointment with Expo 67 in Montreal, and how were you approached for that?
Well, that's an interesting story. Really, it all started in the last few weeks of Sir Robert Menzies, Prime Minister of Australia, who had been in office for many, many years and was internationally very well known. He didn't really think Expo, he didn't know what Expo was about really, and nor did anybody else, because this is an unusual thing back in 1967 with Expos, the Expo for Montreal.
You know, I think it's a very interesting point which you've mentioned, because I have to let our listeners know that Australia had not been represented in its own right at an exposition for many decades before Montreal. Montreal Expo 67 was a landmark achievement for Australia because it was the first time in a very, very long time that Australia had been represented in her own right. Prior to that, she had been part of the British representation at World Expositions, but at that I'll let you continue, Jim.
Right, in 1965, when this proposition for an expo came along, as we've just said, nobody quite knew what it was all about. And Cabinet requested, I'd been chief architect in Canberra for 3 years, a relative youngster, I suppose, at that time, and I had a tremendous job, and the request came through with no explanation as to what the building was to hold or how it was to be designed or anything like that. The only thing I had was a block of land which measured so much by so much. And so overnight we came up with a design and submitted that off to Cabinet to let them see what an expo building would look like. And I never expected to hear any more of this because I anticipated it would go out to a private architect. But the following morning, Senator John Gorton, who was Minister for Works, rang through and said, I want to see Maccormick over here in a hurry. And so I turned up where his office was, and he said, Maccormick, he didn't call me Mr. Maccormick, he said, Maccormick, Cabinet was very impressed with that design of yours, that model that you made, and we'd like to appoint you pavilion architect on the understanding that if it's a success, you can share in all the publicity and glory. If it's a failure, you have to accept full responsibility. Well, obviously I chose to proceed this risky venture, and what a marvellous thing for a designer or an architect. No limitations, no restrictions, no brief, nothing. And so the design that was produced overnight like that was the design that was eventually built.
Amazes me is that you were the architect in '67, and then, of course, with World's Fairs, there's a huge, years of planning before the next one. So how do you sort of transition in such a relatively short period of time, 3 years to design a brand new building, doing with almost the same function, but a completely different audience?
So you couldn't be more correct. There was insufficient time to design the Montreal building, getting it documented, working drawings, getting it constructed. There was just enough time. But in the case of the next expo that came along, it was even worse. But let me just give you a little bit of the political background to this. And that was the Institute of Architects had woken up to the fact that this was a marvellous public relations exercise for them and any architect who happened to be a designer there. And they prepared a short list of their recommendation as to who the architect for the next expo at Osaka should be, and submitted this to Cabinet. What went on behind the doors of the Cabinet room in this particular decision-making meeting, I have no idea. But it transpired that I was advised that the Cabinet had decided that the same team would be used again for this coming expo, which would mean Jim Maccormick for pavilion architect, Robin Boyd for exhibits designer. And this hurt a number of people who felt that the Commonwealth government was monopolising a marvellous PR for them, and that it wasn't being shared around. At any rate, the next expo at Osaka was, it was then administratively changed as far as responsibility is concerned, because they had now instituted a new organisation, part of the Prime Minister's Department, called the Australian Exhibit Organisation. And so when I was working for the Commonwealth directly, Robin Boyd, who was the exhibits designer, was working for the Australian Exhibit Organisation, who was giving him a different brief from what I was getting. It all began to get very, very complicated, and I'll go into that shortly.
Right. Well, without going into too much detail, though, how were you approached for Expo 70, or was that more or less a fait accompli?
It was more or less a fait accompli. And look, I was a new chum as far as being in the public service. I didn't know how to play the game of climbing the stairs to opportunity, but I seemed to realise that I had a very good friend in this John Gordon, who was first of all Minister and then later Prime Minister. And if I got a gong, that's an award, for the first Expo, I'm sure it was he who arranged it. And I remember with the Japanese Expo on Australia Day, when he was visiting to part of the official party, I noticed him gesture to someone to bring me over to him, to speak to him, which I thought was a very nice gesture. And I think I had a very good friend there, and I'm sure it was he. He's dead now. I'm sure that he would have been strongly supporting the fact that I would be the pavilion architect for the Expo at Japan. From Sir Peter Lawler, who was head of the Prime Minister's Department, he said, "Jim, we need you down in Canberra again. Who do I speak to get you down here?" And I said, "Well, I suppose you speak to my boss, the Vice-Chancellor." I'm not exaggerating to say that the next morning I was on a plane and I was down in Canberra and brought over to a meeting that was being held of the various heads of departments who are going to be involved in this next Expo. And there would have been 10 or 12 people sitting around the table, and the chairman got up and he said, "Jim, we've been waiting for you." And it was a real shot in the arm for my ego. I mean, I couldn't believe that this was going on. And they explained that they were running short of time, that everything had been left to the last moment. There was only something like 6 months to design the building and get it built. This, of course, was a smaller type expo where the buildings, prefabricated buildings, were made available to various governments that were participating. And the country had the opportunity to modify the interior. So it wasn't quite so bad. And one of the people sitting at the table was a young man who you might contact in the future, called Richard Johnson. And Richard was a member of the government department who had really taken my job when I left. And he then went on after a year or so to design the next pavilion at Japanese, where was it, Tsukuba. And then I think he did Vancouver after that. But he's now one of the top architects in Sydney, Richard Johnson. You might make contact sometime, because I'm sure there's a few good stories there. So back to Spokane. This time I was appointed to not only design the interior of the building, but also select the exhibits. And as a special gesture to Robin Boyd, who died some years before, in 1971, a large part of the exhibit was the Australian Ugliness, which is a famous book that's been published by Robin Boyd. And we had photographs to illustrate this, good and bad. And I selected, of course, a model of the Opera House and a model of other buildings that were being built in Australia, and had Bruce Petty's cartoon blown up, and it was great fun. I really enjoyed it, doing the exhibits as well as the building. So all that went on that way, and we started working on our own Brisbane plan, master plan, and for submission to the BIE, and then tried to get the Prime Minister's support. And again, the same Prime Minister was saying no, he wouldn't support it. I don't know what the reason was. But luckily, terrible thing to say, he hurt his back and had to retire from Prime Ministership for 3 or 4 months. And his deputy, who took over the reins of authority as acting Prime Minister, was of the same party as the Premier of the state of Queensland, Joe Peterson. And without any hesitation whatsoever, approved the submission of the BIE, and away it went and took off and was approved in 1983.
Yes, well, it's an amazing story, isn't it? All from Expo 67, Expo 70, Expo 74, Spokane, but it's very interesting to see how that, what they did for Spokane eventually became the inspiration for Brisbane.
Yeah.
And, but
I might also say, John, I was approached by the Canadians and the Japanese because of the fact that I'd approached them, consultants back in their expos. When they came to take part in Expo 88, they sort of automatically got me to be their consulting architect. So I can say that I was doing the working drawings and supervision of the Japanese pavilion as well as the Canadian one for Expo 88.
But you actually did much more than that, Jim, because you were the joint chief architect for the whole Expo site, weren't you?
That's correct, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, and how did that come about? Was that also like a fait accompli, or did you really have to lobby?
It was a very tightly fought lobby with political implications, and I had the background of experience that I was a small-time operator. I joined forces with one of the bigger firms in town who had the staff and the organisation, and we called ourselves Bly Maccormick 88. Graham Bly was the partner, and Jim Maccormick, and so it was Bly Maccormick 88 who was responsible for all the master planning. Yeah, but I had a second office going, which was about 8 people who did the documentation on other projects like these 2 Canadian and Japanese pavilions. So I was running a joint role, and I made no secret of it, but there are a few people who are rather resentful that I was doing 2 things at the one time.
That's fascinating. And so was Expo 88 the jewel in the crown in terms of the bicentennial, and also the jewel in the crown in terms of your professional career as well, or?
Oh, I think so. Although I'd like to think that Montreal, that was, if you ask me of all the pavilions, I'd say that I really felt closer to the success I feel that occurred with Montreal rather than other expos.